Navigation has always been one of the most important skills for humans. It's never been easy for our ancestors to travel and explore their environment or survive on a long journey. But thanks to the GPS service, all of us have a much easier life today. From our daily lives to aviation and shipping industry, GPS has totally changed our lives. But how did GPS start? Why did it become public? And why on earth is GPS free to use for everyone on the planet? The Soviet Union did the impossible. Nobody could predict what was coming. Russians launched their first satellite into the orbit. The news came out as a shock to the American public. The successful launch was quickly followed by the launch of 2 additional satellites, including one that successfully carried a dog into space. Yes, a dog. It was a sign that the United States has finally fallen behind in military technology in its race with the Soviets. But what really was the main concern among American authorities was something else. They were worried about how much this advancement would help Russian weapon systems. The concerns grew more when news came out that Soviets have also tested their first intercontinental missile that year. President Eisenhower welcomed the satellite launch and encouraged the efforts to establish what he called freedom of space. The idea that outer space belonged to everyone and therefore satellites are allowed to fly over foreign countries. Many considered this an attempt to calm down the American public and downplay the significance of Russian military technology by describing the satellite as just a civilian program. But inside the government, everyone knew there was going to be a huge national security problem if America doesn't come up with its own satellites. There was one and only one objective now: to launch a better and more impressive satellite into the orbit as soon as possible. On December of 1957, Vanguard satellite was about to be launched. American government did significant promotion for the event. It was going to be yet another proud moment in the history of America and restore faith in the military superiority of the US.
A preliminary to the scheduled launching of a 21-pound satellite in March.
The entire nation is waiting for the historic moment which could assure everyone that America is not losing the Cold War. Little did they know the second shock in the space race is coming for them.
Missile, a loss of thrust, and fall back to Earth in split seconds.
Newspapers called the event one of the most embarrassing moments of the US history. They started publishing memes about it. Yes, memes were a thing even back then. And they called the satellite names like Flopnik to suggest that it was just a bad copy of the Soviet Sputnik.
We were convinced as Americans, because we had so convincingly won World War II, that we were the dominant power in the world. We had to be. Missiles were being built. We were practicing as if there was going to be a third world war, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, here was this first man-made satellite being orbited by our arch enemy.
Back then, the concept of a satellite wasn't really understood. They were viewed as something very dangerous that could attack an entire country from outer space with unknown weapons, something like what you see in alien movies.
Major John Glenn Jr., the Marine Corps jet pilot. What do you think of the Russian satellite, which is circling the Earth at 18,000 miles per hour?
Well, to say the least, George, they're out of this world, but...
The US government desperately needed to prove once again that it's not a second world power. Just a few months after the failure of the first launch, Explorer 1 was launched to the orbit successfully on 31 January 1958. Finally, the United States was also a member of the Space Club.
A few years later, during mid-60s, Navy scientists came up with a cool idea to track the location of America's most precious assets during the Cold War, these submarines that were carrying nuclear missiles. They started experimenting to see if they can track the US submarines by using the radio signals received from 6 satellites that were orbiting the poles. This was crucial to the Navy's ability to navigate the submarines that were carrying nuclear missiles and to know exactly where they are at any moment. The system was simple. They received radio signals simultaneously from 6 satellites orbiting the poles at the same time. The submarine could analyze this data and pinpoint its own location based on it. It would take a few minutes each time, but that was still a breakthrough technology at the time. This became the world's first successful satellite tracking system, invented not by the space program, but by the Navy scientists. In the early 70s, the US Department of Defense knew that it needed a better, more reliable and faster satellite navigation system. They wanted to use navigation system everywhere at any moment and with 0 errors. So they started to develop a 24 satellite system that could provide all branches of Army with a space-based radio navigation system. Each of these satellites would orbit Earth every 12 hours, sending radio signals to the surface. A device would receive these signals from 4 different satellites simultaneously
and find out 2 major factors: its north-south position and its east-west position.
Having these 2 components, the device could immediately determine its coordinates, or simply its exact position on the map. They called it the Global Positioning System, or GPS. At the time, nobody in their wildest dreams would have imagined that one day this space-based navigation system would be available to the entire world and that it would be completely free of charge. September 5, 1983, a Korean Airlines Boeing 747 took off from New York Airport with the destination Seoul, South Korea. It was carrying 246 passengers and 23 crew members.
Neither the passengers nor the crew members had any idea what was going to happen while flying over Alaska.
About 10 minutes after the takeoff, the airplane slowly began to deviate from its original route and continued to fly forward for the next 5.5 hours. Later analysis of the flight data showed that this deviation was probably caused by the aircraft's autopilot system. Because of this small deviation from the original route, the flight entered the Soviet airspace at some point and caused the Soviet Air Force to go on red alert. The pilots had no idea what they've done. They thought they were on their straight route, which they were supposed to be for the next few hours. So they continued heading forward and eventually exited the Soviet airspace. Russians continued tracking the aircraft to make sure it's not a danger, but the unfortunate thing was the aircraft entered the Soviet airspace once again later on its deviated route. At this moment, the pilots and the crew had no idea that units of the Soviet Air Defense Forces had been tracking their aircraft for more than 1 hour, and while they unknowingly re-entered the Soviet airspace again, it left the Russians with only one option: to classify their aircraft as a military target. 3 Su-15 fighters and 1 MiG-23 fighter took off from a nearby airbase. The mission was clear: to identify the aircraft and, if necessary, to take it down. They managed to make visual contact with the Boeing in a few minutes, but the dark night prevented them from exact assessment of it. What was it? A fighter? A spy plane? They had no idea. After failing to make critical identification of the aircraft, the pilot of the lead Su-15 fighter fired warning shots with its cannon, but nobody can look out of a civilian aircraft window in the middle of the night and see them. At the time of historically high tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, the inevitable happened. The lead fighter got the order. It moved back into the position where it could hit the aircraft. It took another moment. Then it fired 2 K-8 air-to-air missiles at the aircraft. It was over. Everyone died.
I'm coming before you tonight about the Korean Airline massacre, the attack by the Soviet Union against 269 innocent men, women, and children aboard an unarmed Korean passenger plane. This crime against humanity must never be forgotten, here or throughout the world. Our prayers tonight are with the victims and their families in their time of terrible grief. Our hearts go out to them, to brave people like Catherine McDonald, the wife of a congressman, whose composure and eloquence...
This came as a shock to the public. Everyone started asking questions. Whose fault is that? How did a civilian airplane enter the Soviet airspace in the middle of the night? Not once, but twice. But the most important question was,
how can we prevent other flights from such a tragic fate? The answer was clear. Without a precise, unmistakable navigation system, an incident like this could happen at any time again. The only way to ensure an airplane never enters a restricted area was to give it the ability to pinpoint their exact location at every second. In other words, only GPS could make a difference, the technology that was exclusive to the Department of Defense. Ronald Reagan issued an executive order making global navigation system accessible to all civilians. But this plan had its own limitations, like the degraded accuracy by the US government, or the ability of the US government to deny certain users access at any time. These restrictions were totally discontinued in May 2000, when Bill Clinton signed a law to make GPS what it is today, a globally accessible service that we cannot live without. GPS has for sure led to some of the most important achievements in the human history. Thousands of lives are saved every year only because of GPS. The global shipping is working in an astonishing speed and precision that would be totally impossible without GPS. In fact, you can take a look at the apps on your phone to see how many useful services you're getting based on GPS. This would all be impossible if GPS wasn't free for all. It seems like our daily lives depend on GPS now. Today, Russia, China, India, Japan, and the European Union all have their own global navigation satellite programs being developed independently from the good old GPS.